Hey everybody, this is a section from Baruch Knei-Paz's The Social and Political Thought of Leon Trotsky. I should probably try to speak louder. It's titled The Good Society or a Vision of the Communist Millennium. So let's go. Shit. Okay, so here we go. To conclude the study of Trotsky's social and political thought with a section on Trotsky's views of the future communist society may be both superfluous and misleading. Superfluous because such views should be more or less evident from all that has been written already about Trotsky's thought, as well as from the fact that as a Marxist, Trotsky may be expected to share the usual Marxist notions about the future. Misleading because it may give the very wrong impression that Trotsky, any more than other Marxists, had any definite or systematic conception of the future. As we shall presently see, Trotsky's remarks on this subject were very general and very infrequent, and it would be a misrepresentation to take them for anything more than occasional, almost spontaneous observations. Still, a man's vision of the future, however vague, cannot be discounted as an element influencing his motives, his ideas, and his behavior, and in the case of Trotsky this is particularly so. The very style and mentality of Trotsky exude a kind of visionary essence. Many of Trotsky's writings and ideas, including particularly the central conception of the permanent revolution, are clearly affected by it, though they do not for this reason cease to be works of realistic social analysis. It may be worthwhile, therefore, to gather together in concentrated form some of Trotsky's thoughts on the future communist society and thereby take account of, without, however, overestimating its theoretical value, this characteristic element in Trotsky's approach to politics and society. Georges Sorel once observed that, quote, to offer a theoretical analysis of the future economic order would be to attempt to erect an ideological superstructure in advance of the conditions of production on which that ideological superstructure must be built, end quote. Thus, Sorel concluded, quote, any such attempt would be non-Marxist, end quote. Footnote, quoted in Carr, The Bolshevik Revolution, Volume 2, End footnote. Sorel need not have worried, for not only Marx, as Sorel knew, but Marx's subsequent adherents as well made few serious attempts of this kind. Footnote. Of course, Marx did not always resist the temptation, and general observations about the communist future may be found throughout his works, particularly the early writings and the Communist Manifesto. For a survey of the nebulous views of Soviet Marxists past and present on this subject, see Theodor Deno, The Communist Millennium, the Soviet View. End footnote. The best known exception is, of course, Lenin's State and Revolution, but State and Revolution merely vindicates the wisdom of Marxist general reticence to dabble in, quote, futurology, since from it Lenin emerges with an absurdly naive streak. Footnote, always assuming, of course, that Lenin was serious when Lenin spoke in State and Revolution of the administration of the future society as being a matter of simple, quote, account keeping, end quote, a function everyone would be capable of performing. This work, however, is unique in Lenin's canon and at odds with the fundamentally unspeculative character of Lenin's thought. End footnote. Christ. The reasons for such reticence, however, were not only doctrinal, in the sense defined by Sorel. They were also rooted in the fact that as a political movement, Marxism had always sought to avoid being identified with the kind of, quote, utopianism which characterized the ideas of the early socialist or anarchist, and which more often than not culminated in the merely imaginary construction of ideal communities. Footnote. For a defense, however, of, quote, utopian socialism and a critical analysis of the Marxist, quote, scientific utopia, see Martin Buber, Paths in Utopia, published 1949, at least in English. End footnote. Let me see. The description for Paths in Utopia says, in this work, Buber expounds and defends the Zionist experiment, a federal system of communities on a cooperative basis. Buber looks to the anarchists Proudhon, Kropotkin, and Gustav Landauer, but selects only the part of their doctrines appropriate to his case. Back to the text. The stress in Marxism was on the unity of theory and practice, on the need to change the world, on the inevitability of the class struggle, on, of course, practical revolutionary activity. It presented itself as a doctrine and a movement acting on and in accordance with reality, and it preferred to leave model building to the historical process itself. In spite of this, however, Marxism was the most future-oriented of doctrines, a fact so obvious as to require little elaboration. Rejecting the whole of existing reality, Marxism enthusiastically contemplated the necessary advent of a novel society, only the bare outlines of which were as yet discernible. The difference between Marxism and, quote, utopian socialism were obvious, but utopian elements were there nevertheless, whether they were formulated in the negative form of the disappearance of classes and the division of labor, of social antagonisms and of the state, or in the positive form of the establishment of truly collective relationships, of universal liberation, of abundance and creative labor. The promise of a millennium was inherent in Marxism, and the Chiliastic dream was certainly a part of its appeal and its motive force. What's Chiliastic mean? Chiliastic means another term for millenarian. What has been called the tension between Jesus Christ. What has been called the, quote, tension between eschatology and dialectics, end quote, a Marxist thought was never resolved, and the impression persisted, or was made to persist for obvious reasons, by the political movements which embraced Marx's doctrines. Not only that the, quote, end of prehistory, end quote, was fully imminent in the here and now, but that it signified the end of history itself, in the sense of an aimless, infinitely changing, and not always salutary process. Footnote. Aveniri, the social and political thought of Karl Marx. One second. The description for the social and political thought of Karl Marx by Shlomo Avineri says, ever since the discovery of Marx's early writings, most of the literature concerned with Marx's intellectual development is centered around the so-called gap between the, quote, young Marx, who is considered to be a humanist thinker, and the, quote, older Marx, who is held to be a determinist with little concern for anything outside Marx's narrow theory of historical materialism. Dr. Avenari claims that such a gap between the, quote, young and, quote, older Marx did not exist. Avenari supports his claim by a detailed study of the whole corpus of Marx's writing on social and political thought. Back to the text. It is within the framework of this millenarian tradition of Marxism that one can best appreciate the nature of Trotsky's vision of the future. One must stress for this very reason that it was a vision, not a conception, much less a program. One will not find in it a, quote, theoretical analysis of the future economic order, end quote, nor the kind of mundane, albeit utopian, discussion of administrative questions as occurs in Lenin's State and Revolution, nor even very much about the processes of the, quote, withering away of the state and of classes, beyond, of course, the taking of such assumptions for granted. In matters of a time-circumscribed nature, the revolution in Russia, developments in the West, and so on, Trotsky was not, of course, reluctant to speak in programmatic predictive terms. Insofar as the more or less remote future was concerned, however, Trotsky took the language of prophecies to be more appropriate, and that of down-to-earth analysis to be almost demeaning. Asked once to predict what American society would look like, quote, if it should go communist, end quote, Trotsky offered, in an ostensibly serious manner, a long list of concrete prospects and then, as if despairing at the absurdity of such exercises, concluded in mocking irony, quote, in the third year of Soviet rule in America, you will no longer chew gum, end quote. End quote, Trotsky. Footnote, this article is commissioned by and published under the title, If America Should Go Communist, in Liberty Magazine, 23rd of March, 1935. End footnote. The future, therefore, had to be conjured up through inspired vision, both because such vision was itself inspiring, as no reality could be, and because the future promised by communism was to be glorious an era in the life of mankind. One may, of course, not unjustifiably, frown cynically at such of Trotsky's presumptions, but one cannot deny the force and the confidence with which Trotsky paraded them. It would therefore be pointless to try and organize Trotsky's observations on the communist future under clearly delineated headings and categories, as if Trotsky had thought out the implications of that future for the manifold areas of human activity. Footnote. Deno attributes to Trotsky more defined and more schematized views about the future than Trotsky's utterances can sustain or can be interpreted to convey. End footnote. Rather, one should take the vision in the vision's totality, for what the vision is worth, and thereby preserve at least the vision's spirit and eloquence, for these, as becomes a vision, are its most admirable qualities. They might not convince us of the validity of the vision, but they will convey the vision's impact upon Trotsky himself. Quote, without a broad political view of the future, end quote, Trotsky once wrote, quote, I cannot conceive either of political activity or of intellectual life in general, end quote, Trotsky. Footnote, cited in Wolff, Three Who Made a Revolution. The three Who Made a Revolution, a biographical history of Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin by Bertram D. Wolff. The description of this book said, the lives of three men who made the Russian Revolution possible, Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin, are the focus of this biographical account of the rise of socialism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Bertram Wolff, a political scientist and historian of Russia, knew Trotsky and Stalin personally, and here brings his profound insider's knowledge to bear on his subjects. Three Who Made a Revolution recounts the early lives and influences of the three leaders and shows the development of the three leaders' diverging ideologies as decades gave strength to their cause and brought Russia closer to its turning point, a revolution that would alter the course of the 20th century. Back to the text. The basis of the vision, that which made the vision, from Trotsky's point of view, credible and not merely rhetorical and fantastic, was the assumption that mankind was at that stage of development at which mankind could potentially solve all of mankind's economic problems. This had been, of course, Marx's assumption as well. Capitalism, having universalized, mechanized, and rationalized economic production, had become an anachronism since it continued to sustain a society. It continued to sustain a society based on competition, supply and demand, inequality and class supremacy, all factors characteristic of conditions of limited resources, shortage and even scarcity. These conditions now persisted not out of necessity, but out of the greed of the bourgeois class. The inevitable advent of socialism would both reflect the artificiality of such conditions and the capacity of society to provide abundance and affluence for all of society's members. Trotsky thus believed, like Marx before Trotsky, that once economic problems became merely technical problems, once technology became so advanced that technology could both solve such problems and release man from most physical labor, once, moreover, the struggle for existence became unnecessary, men could channel men's energies into truly human, creative pursuits and live self-determined lives. Was it so fantastic, Trotsky asked, to envisage therefore a future in which, economic problems having ceased to engage man would develop all his latent talents for other activities and rise to new spiritual heights? Footnote, see in this connection and in relation to what follows the concluding part of his 1932 Copenhagen speech. End footnote. This optimism in the capacity of knowledge, particularly scientific knowledge buttressed by technological skill, for overcoming once and for all the barriers to unlimited economic production and distribution, explains the theoretical reasons why Trotsky rejected all discussion of the future in terms of economic and administrative arrangements. Mankind, according to Trotsky, having become accustomed hitherto to think that economic survival was an imminent problem of existence, could not yet imagine a future in which such a problem simply did not arise. But this was precisely the point about the future, that the future would reveal the historical nature of the problem's relevance to a particular stage only of development, and the problems being, therefore, non-imminent in existence. To understand the nature of the future, one must, in a sense, forget about economics. To understand what is meant by communism, one must make an intellectual leap, in this case assisted by a discriminating imagination, out of all hitherto assimilated experience into the realm of the world liberated from the dilemmas of economic survival. It is not what Marx had in mind when Marx spoke of the leap from the, quote, realm of necessity into the realm of freedom. Is this not what Marx had in mind when Marx spoke of the leap from the, quote, realm of necessity into the realm of freedom, end quote? This being so, one could not speak of the actual economic and administrative arrangements which would prevail under communism. One could only imagine that the conditions for such arrangements would be entirely different, and that, therefore, the arrangements would be unlike anything known until now. Consider, Trotsky suggested, the example of money, since in conditions of abundance, where each will really be able to receive according to his needs, money becomes redundant in principle. One can easily imagine money's disappearance. What, if anything, will replace money is a problem not worth fretting about, since it will have been resolved in the context of the new conditions of abundance. In general, problems of the organization of production, of the distribution of goods, of the satisfaction of material wants, of both social and economic administration, will acquire a subsidiary and spontaneous character. One can imagine also that such social institutions as the family, not to mention relations between the sexes in general, will have been entirely transformed. It is useless, and in any case unnecessary, to ask in advance what they will be like. What is important is to understand that liberation from economic exigencies creates conditions of greater freedom, and that such conditions make possible new and more creative social relations. Besides, economic abundance, like communism, presupposes the existence of an international community divested once and for all of the need to waste its energies on national competition, on preparation for wars, on the investment of its human and material resources in non-productive enterprises. For Trotsky, therefore, the possibilities of human endeavor under communism appear to be boundless. Given the realization of freedom from economic anxieties, given the consequent release of human labor and capacities to be occupied otherwise, where else would they flow? Trotsky asked, except into those realms of human endeavor, hitherto the exclusive property of the fortunate few. We return, therefore, to the central preoccupation of Trotsky's vision of the communist future, namely the prospect of human creativity, particularly in the arts and the sciences, becoming universal. This theme runs through all of Trotsky's evocations of the future, and one may pick almost randomly for examples of it. In early 1918, for instance, addressing an audience of workers, Trotsky spoke about the ultimate aims of the revolution. Quote, "We must see to it that our children, our younger brothers, will have the opportunity of coming to know all the conquests of the mind, of the arts and sciences, and that they will be able to live as befits human beings who call themselves, quote, lords of creation," end quote. End quote. Trotsky. But rather than multiply the sources and citations, it seems best to quote a famous passage which concludes his 1923 book, Literature and Revolution, and which, though it sometimes reaches exaggerated heights of rhapsody, gives the most complete evocation of the vision that so evidently moved Trotsky. Jesus Christ on the cross. What is in the air? So it's almost dark outside in the middle of November. I don't know what the fuck I'm allergic to out here, but it's something. Sorry, real quick, the description for Literature and Revolution by Leon Trotsky. The little description says, Leon Trotsky penned this engaging book to elucidate the complex way in which art informs and can alter our understanding of the world, features new reader-friendly explanatory notes. Back to the text, and this is a quote from Literature and Revolution. Quote, "Having rationalized his economic system, man will not preserve a trace of the present stagnant and worm-eaten domestic life. The care for food and education, will become the subject of social initiative and of endless collective creativeness. Woman will at last free herself from her semi-servile condition, Experiments in social education, will take place to a degree which has not been dreamed of before. Communist life will not be formed blindly, like coral islands, but will be built consciously, will be tested by thought, will be directed and corrected. Life will cease to be elemental, Man, who will learn how to move rivers and mountains, will not only be able to add his own life richness, brilliancy, and intensity, but also a dynamic quality of the highest degree." End quote. Trotsky. More than that, man at last will begin to harmonize man's self in earnest. Man will make it his business to achieve beauty by giving the movement of his own limbs the utmost precision, purposefulness, and economy in his work, his walk, and his play. He will try to master first the semi-conscious and then unconscious process in his own organism.
Wait, is this still a quote? What the hell? Shit, I think this is still a quote. So let me start from where I was. More than that, this is Trotsky speaking. More than that, man at last will begin to harmonize man's self in earnest. Man will make it his business to achieve beauty by giving the movement of his own limbs the utmost precision, purposefulness and economy in his work, his walk, and his play. Hello. He will try to master first the semi-conscious, then the unconscious process in his own organism. ... The human species, coagulated Homo sapiens, will once more enter into a state of radical transformation, and in his own hands will become an object of the most complicated methods of artificial selection and psychophysical training. This is entirely in accord with evolution. Man first drove the dark elements out of industry and ideology by displacing barbarian routine by scientific technique and religion by science. Afterwards, man drove the unconscious out of politics by overthrowing monarchy and class with democracy and rationalist parliamentarism, and then with the clear and open Soviet dictatorship. The blind elements have settled most heavily in economic relations, but man is driving them out from there also, by means of the socialist organization of economic life. This makes it possible to reconstruct fundamentally the traditional family life. Finally, the nature of man himself is hidden in the depths and darkest corner of the unconscious, of the elemental, of the subsoil. It is not self-evident that the greatest efforts of investigative thought and of creative initiative will be in that direction? So let me repeat that last bit. Is it not self-evident that the greatest efforts of investigative thought and of creative initiative will be in that direction? The human race will not have ceased to crawl on all fours before God, kings and capital, in order later to submit humbly before the dark laws of heredity and blind sexual selection. ! Man will make it his purpose to master his own feelings, to raise man's instincts to the heights of consciousness, ... to raise himself to a new plane, to create a higher social biological type, or, if you please, a Superman. It is difficult to predict the extent of self-government which the man of the future may reach, or the heights to which he may carry his technique. Social construction and psychophysical self-education will become two aspects of one and the same process. All the arts, literature, drama, painting, music, and architecture will lend this process beautiful form. More correctly, the shell in which the cultural construction and self-education of communist man will be enclosed will develop all the vital elements of contemporary art to the highest point. Man will become immeasurably stronger, wiser, and subtler, ... The forms of life will become dynamically dramatic. The average human type will rise to the heights of an Aristotle, a Goethe, or a Marx, and above the ridge new peaks will rise, end quote. Trotsky, Literature and Revolution. Let us now pause to inquire whether such utter optimism in the powers of man did not, in fact, spill over into the realm of sheer fantasy, for we are not concerned here with the actual credibility of the vision. Suffice it to say that more than 50 years after the writing of this passage, its prophecies seem no less incredible. Let us instead ask the question more immediately pertinent to the nature of Trotsky's vision, and perhaps to Trotsky's thought as a whole. What was the source of this enormous optimism, this complete confidence in man's powers for self-mastery, this utter faith that there were no limits to human ambition? In part, as we have noted, it lay in the Marxist conviction that only arbitrary economic arrangements barred man's way to complete freedom, and therefore that once these were done away with, unheard of human possibilities would unfold. In this sense, communism itself was a source for Trotsky's optimism. Beyond, and perhaps regardless of, this doctrinal influence, it seems that Trotsky's own innate nature was also a source. Doubts, tribulations, bewilderment, despair, none of these found a place in Trotsky's character or psychology. From earliest youth and throughout his life, Trotsky exuded confidence in the future. Amongst Trotsky's earliest writings is an essay entitled On Pessimism, Optimism, the 20th Century, and Many Other Things. It was written in 1901, that is, at the turn of the century, and in it the young author presented a kind of dialogue between an incorrigible, quote, pessimist, and as it turns out, a no less incorrigible, quote, optimist. The former enumerates a long list of human horrors, murder, starvation, racial hatred, which have persisted into the new century. Nothing, Trotsky claims, has changed or will, nothing, this pessimist claims, has changed or will change. These horrors are the real future. History and reality are obviously on his side. Yet the, quote, optimist, unshaken, replies, quote, no, that is only the present, end quote. Contempt for the present, a refusal to be reconciled to the present's reality, and an unbreachable certainty in the capacity of the future to transform the present. These constitute an intrinsic, essential part of Trotsky's mentality and allowed Trotsky to nearly always transcend Trotsky's immediate environment. They combined well with the Marxist faith and doctrine. Almost 40 years after the above essay, on the eve of Trotsky's death, worried about his health, Trotsky drew up his quote, testament and declared in his testament, quote, for 43 years of my conscious life I have remained a revolutionist. For 42 of them I have fought under the banner of Marxism. If I had to begin all over again, I would of course try to avoid this or that mistake, but the main course of my life would remain unchanged. I shall die a proletarian revolutionist, a Marxist, a dialectical materialist, and, consequently, an irreconcilable atheist. My faith in the communist future of mankind is not less ardent. Indeed, it is firmer today than it was in the days of my youth. End quote. Trotsky. The, quote, testament was published in Diary in Exile. This part of the, quote, testament, written on the 27th of February 1940, ends with the words, quote, life is beautiful, let the future generations cleanse life of all evil, oppression and violence, and enjoy life to the full, end quote. But advancing years and illness had depressed Trotsky for some time now. Quote, old age, end quote. Trotsky wrote in 1935, quote, is the most unexpected of all things that happen to a man, end quote. Trotsky, Diary in Exile, end footnote. Less than a week after writing this, Trotsky was contemplating suicide as a way of avoiding a long, drawn-out illness, and Trotsky added a passage to the testament, in the last part of which Trotsky stated, quote, the, quote, suicide, end quote, if such a term is appropriate in this connection, will not in any respect be an expression of an outburst of despair or hopelessness, ... But whatever may be the circumstances of my death, I shall die with unshaken faith in the communist future. This faith in man and his future gives me even now such power of resistance as cannot be given by any religion. End quote. Trotsky. Footnote. Between the two parts of the testament there is an unfinished fragment in which Trotsky bequests all his possessions and literary rights to his wife. End footnote. Such faith, in the face of the bitter political and personal reality of 1940, seemed to border on the irrational. In fact, however, rationalism, or the belief in human reason, was itself a source of Trotsky's optimism. It is implicit in the above quotation from his testament that reason runs through all his thought. The belief in human reason runs through all of Trotsky's thought. But the belief in reason, like the scope of faith, seemed to go beyond reason itself. Partly this was because the rationalism Trotsky inherited, and which Trotsky shared with a long line of revolutionaries, contained an element of fanaticism, and partly it grew out of the conviction that history itself was fully rational and fully comprehensible. In this sense, Trotsky, like other Marxists, though not all equally, was a child of a revolutionary tradition which recognized no boundaries to the powers of man and man's intellectual faculties. In a passage remarkable for its self-awareness, Trotsky wrote in his autobiography, quote, the feeling of the supremacy of the general over the particular became an integral part of my literary and political work. The dull empiricism, the unashamed, cringing worship of the fact which is so often only imaginary and falsely interpreted as that, were odious to me. Beyond the facts I looked for laws, Naturally, this led me more than once into hasty and incorrect generalizations, especially in my younger years when my knowledge, book acquiring, and my experience in life were still inadequate. But in every sphere, barring none, I felt that I could move and act only when I held in my hand the thread of the general. The social revolutionary radicalism, which has become the permanent pivot up for my whole inner life, grew out of this intellectual enmity towards the striving for petty ends, towards out-and-out pragmatism, and towards all that is ideologically without form and theoretically ungeneralized. End quote. Trotsky. End footnote. Sorry, not end footnote. There's no footnote. The joining of Trotsky's optimism and Trotsky's rationalism to Marxism was thus at once the most personally natural and intellectually logical of steps. Socialism represented to Trotsky a, quote, effort to rationalize life, that is, transform life according to the dictates of reason, ... It is only socialism that has set itself the task of embracing reason and subjecting all the activities of man to reason, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote cited in Wolff. Trotsky recalled in My Life that as a boy he could not understand how people were able to accept local superstitions and irrational practices. Quote, people refused to see the light of reason, and this drove me to despair, end quote. Trotsky. And from thence to Lenin and to Bolshevism was perhaps more tortuous a road, but in the end a no less logical one. Quote, rationalism implied that if anything was accepted as theory, it was of course carried out in practice, end quote. Trotsky. This way, Trotsky believed, lay in fact the road to progress, and what was reason if not the primary tool which man took up to create, for specific historical tasks, all those other tools the accumulation and employment of which constituted an assured human advance. For Trotsky, Marxism-Bolshevism was in this sense the most historically complete and most refined of tools, for it both comprehended the course of progress and showed the way to it. It was, for Trotsky, the tool most in keeping with the needs of the 20th century and its tasks. Here it is appropriate to recall that Trotsky frequently drew a historical parallel between Marxism and Protestantism, especially Calvinism. On one occasion in particular, the parallel was strikingly formulated by Trotsky. Quote, Calvinism, with its cast-iron doctrine of predestination, was a mystical form of approach to the causal nature of the historical process. The rising bourgeoisie felt that the laws of history were on the rising bourgeoisie's side, and this consciousness took the form of the doctrine of predestination. The Calvinist rejections of the freedom of the will by no means paralyzed the revolutionary energy of the independents. On the contrary, it constituted the independents' powerful support. The independents felt themselves called to accomplish a great historical task. We may with perfect right draw an analogy between the doctrine of predestination in the Puritan Revolution and the role of Marxism in the Proletarian Revolution. In both cases, the great efforts put forth are not based on subjective caprice, but on a cast-iron causal law, mystically distorted in the one case, scientifically founded in the other. End quote. Trotsky. If one reads Marxism here as Marxism-Bolshevism, and Trotsky would certainly not have objected, the full intended implication of this parallel became even clearer. Like Calvinism, Marxism was not, quote, paralyzed by Marxism's determinist doctrine, but saw in its determinist doctrine a, quote, calling, a duty to carry out the will of history and history's laws. In both cases, these laws were as if comprehended by reason, though in the one mystically and in the other scientifically. Both saw themselves as the harbingers of progress, of a, quote, great historical task, end quote. Both could therefore appeal to those, quote, cast iron and, quote, laws of history for the justification of their mission. Footnote. The parallels between Puritanism and Bolshevism have, of course, been often suggested and analyzed in historical and political literature, but see in particular Michael Walzer, The Revolution of the Saints, a study in the origins of radical politics, published in 1970. The description for Michael Walzer's The Revolution of the Saints, a study in the origin of radical politics, says, "The Revolution of the Saints is a study, both historical and sociological, of the radical political response of the Puritans to disorder. The Revolution of the Saints interprets and analyzes Calvinism as the first modern expression of an unremitting determination to transform, on the basis of an ideology, the existing political and moral order. Michael Walzer examines in detail the circumstances and ideological options of the Puritan intelligentsia and gentry. Walzer sees Puritanism, in sharp contrast to some generally accepted views, as the political theory of intellectuals and gentlemen attempting to create a new government in society." Back to the text and footnote. Where am I? But if Marx was to the communist or proletarian revolution what Calvinism was to the Puritan or bourgeois revolution, were the former just another historical chapter to be superseded, like the latter, by periodic and endless doctrines and revolutionary outbursts, whatever progress or temporary relief each might contribute to mankind? There was a difference, of course, for Trotsky, and it was the difference between a, quote, causal law mystically distorted and one, quote, scientifically founded, and this difference bore the promise of a qualitatively unprecedented, unique era in history. There would continue to be change, but as a product of factors other than social conflict, for a blow had been struck at the one remaining sphere of human life still governed by irrational elemental forces. Quote, "The historic ascent of humanity, taken as a whole, may be summarized as a succession of victories of consciousness over blind forces, in nature, in society, in man himself. Critical and creative thought can boast of critical and creative thought's greatest victories up to now in the struggle with nature. The physico-chemical sciences have already reached a point where man is clearly about to become master of matter, but social relations are still forming in the manner of the Coral Islands. ... In comparison with monarchy and other heirlooms from the cannibals and cave dwellers, democracy is of course a great conquest, but democracy leaves the blind play of forces in the social relations of men untouched. It was against this deeper sphere of the unconscious that the October Revolution was the first to raise its hand." End quote. Trotsky, The History of the Russian Revolution, Book 3. In effect, therefore, the social and political revolution of the 20th century was to be the last revolution. Quote, ... It would seem that we cast an aspersion on future generations when we do not think of future generations as having revolutionists, but we must not forget that the revolutionist is a product of definite historical conditions, a product of class society. The revolutionist is no psychological abstraction. Revolution in revolution's self is no abstract principle, but a material historical fact growing out of class antagonisms, out of the violent subjugation of one class by another. Thus the revolutionist is a concrete historical type, and consequently a temporary type. We are justly proud of belonging to this type, but by means of our work we are creating the conditions for a social order in which no class antagonisms will exist, no revolutions, and thus no revolutionists." End quote. Trotsky. There can be no doubt, consequently, that at some point in Trotsky's personal and intellectual, quote, system, optimism, rationalism, the idea of progress, and not least Marxism, so combined as to create a vision of the millennium, and Trotsky did not abandon this vision even in the increasingly darkening days of the last decade or so of Trotsky's life. The end. Thank you so much for listening. What was this titled? Come on. Sorry. The Good Society, or A Vision of the Communist Millennium. Thank you so much for listening.